something that's very powerful to use when you're in the stage for data cleansing is pivot tables or pivoting as well as melting. And so I'm going to show you the concept here, and hopefully this helps you out. But a lot of times when I'm trying to group things based on specific categories, pivoting allows me to do that. And then also a lot of times I want to put that into just a few columns, and that's what's called melting. So take a look at what you see there on your screen right now. And what you've got with the BD Cust data set is you have an email address, you have website, newsletter, tasting, and then call. And so for each email address, you have 4 unique numbers for that. So if we're wanting to take that information and melt it into basically 3 columns, which would be email address, the value, and then what type it is, then that's what's called melting. And so here's kind of how that concept works. Obviously we have email, and then I'll go with, we have web, news, taste, and call. And then we'll have one person in particular. So then if we just had numbers here, and I can use the ones we've got there, which is 0.0 for the first person, 79, 257, and I'm going to keep it with that number, so 0.0. So that's what one row looks like. When we melt this, what we do is we still have email. We then are going to put all 4 of those categories into one column. And so our variable here, and then our value. And so for C, Apigin at Gmail, the variable in this case would be web. And I'm just going to keep going here. And what we then have is it's taking that one row and making 4 rows out of it into these 3 columns. If we had 10 different rows or columns here, it would put it into, again, these 3 columns, and you would just have then 10 rows here. So it always takes whatever columns you want to be your value variables, and it condenses it into one column with the variable type and the variable value, and that's what melting is. Also, if you had your data this way, you could pivot it based on this being your columns, this being your row, and this being your values. So you probably know what pivoting is, and so we are doing the same thing that you would do in Excel, just with some Python code. So let's go ahead and quickly do that so you can see the syntax. And again, here's my, right now it looks like it's in pivot style. And what we now want to do is go ahead and melt it. So we're going to take the ID variable, which is going to be email address. So that tells you that'll be repeated 4 different times if there's 4 different columns. And then here are the different value variables. So I'm telling it these 4 columns. If I only did 3 of the columns, then I would only see 3 rows for each email address. So I'll go ahead and select, create that. So BD_melt. I'll do a sample so you can see a bunch of different ones. And you see how now you have a variable and then you have a value and the different ones here. I'm going to go ahead and do the head part. I think that'll help you out a little bit. You can see then here's that WPET, and you can see website here is a 0, and that's this value right here. So, and of course it does list them all directly there. You can see if I was to do a describe for that, what it's basically doing is it's giving you the average, the count, and so on for all 4 columns that are now put together. So that's how you melt it from a pivot table. And then you can go the opposite way. I want to take this data. I'm going to go ahead and put this back to sample. I'm going to take this, where I have an email address, a variable, and a value, and I want to pivot it out so that I'll have a column for each unique value that I have here for the variable, and then of course it'll put the number in the right place. So again, just to take a look, you can see how many I have for each one. There's a null value for each, which I had a little bit of dirty data here that we're playing around with for these videos. And then if I go ahead and take this, I'm going to just rename so I get a little bit better name. So now I've got type. Instead of the word variable, I've got the word type. Instead of value, I've got sales. Okay, let's get into pivot. And again, you have this for you. If you click on the hyperlinks, it will take you to something that hopefully makes it easier for you to understand. If I click on that, you can see it brings up the page in Pandas for you to get all the information. So I'm going to pivot it, and the index is going to be the email address. Think of that as the row. The columns then will be type, and then the value sales. So very similar to how you do this in Excel, except that we're just doing it with one line of code to do it. So go ahead and execute that, Shift return. Let's take a look at that now. And you can see it did alphabetically put it, so it's not the exact same as the thing I had up top, but now I have one row for each email address, and now I have 4 different columns. So that's how you pivot, that's how you melt your different data to get it more ready to use in in some type of model. And again, I use this a lot when I want to pivot things based on maybe the month, and then I want to look at each one of the categories per month. This is a great example of how I can do that. And then a lot of times I'll have to melt it back in so that I can use it in a model. So a lot of times I pivot things, then I melt it, and then I put it into a data frame to be able to use for a predictive model.